Welcome, everybody. We are here with Congressman John Sarbanes, who represents Maryland's 3rd Congressional District. Thank you for agreeing to this question and answer period. My first question deals with walking and chewing gum at the same time, the issue about legislating while also investigating. You were the sponsor of a key House bill that was passed in the House, H.R. 1, which dealt a whole range of issues from campaign finance reform to voter suppression to ethics and so on. And also H.R. 8 was also passed in the House. What I'd like you to expand upon is the nature of the legislation being passed in Congress, and then I want to jump to how we can do a better job, or the Democrats can do a better job of controlling the narrative about the legislation.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to participate with this and answer some questions. And I want to thank you for your keen interest in all of the issues that are front and center in terms of what the Democrats are trying to do. You're absolutely right that we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we are doing that as a party. The challenge is always getting the message out to the broad public so that they know that that's happening on Capitol Hill. When it comes to the legislation, I mean, obviously, over time, in a sustaining way, that's the primary responsibility that members of Congress have, to try to translate the will of the people into good, positive, constructive legislative solutions. We are guided in that by what we hear from our constituents. And the Democrats made a promise to the electorate that if we were given the gavel in the House of Representatives, which we were in 2018, that we would very quickly make sure we started getting onto the floor of the House legislation that responded to the priorities of the public. And we can talk more about some of the specifics of that, but certainly front and center, and this was embodied in H.R. 1, the For the People Act, was this idea of we got to start doing things that will fight the corruption and the rigged system in Washington, promote democracy reform, and let the average person back in to Washington and to their own democracy. And H.R. 1 was designed to do that. It really responded to the input we were getting from across the country. Fix voting so you don't have to run an obstacle course to get to the ballot box in America. Make sure that when people go to Washington, they behave themselves. So that gets to the issue of ethics and transparency and accountability. And don't get tangled up in the money. The public has been telling us that for decades. They don't like that relationship between big money and the way policy gets made in Washington. So we have a lot of reforms there that empower everyday Americans against the influence of special interests and big money. So obviously, Paul, our first responsibility on a continuing basis is take the will of the people, translate that into legislation, and then try to get it passed. And we've done that, I think, in a number of areas. We'll come back and talk about those more. You mentioned gun safety, obviously very topical right now. The corruption effort to fight that I've mentioned in terms of H.R. 1, but there's other things having to do with the economy, healthcare, the environment that we put on the floor, we've passed. Now the problem is they've gone over to Mitch McConnell in the Senate, the graveyard of good legislation, and we can talk more about why that's a problem and what we do to respond to it. So that's the legislative side. That's the walking side. The chewing gum side is, one of the reasons that Democrats were given the gavel in 2018 was because the public wanted to see checks and balances restored in Washington. And that's the whole investigative side and oversight part of our responsibility. I sit on the Oversight Committee that's chaired by Elijah Cummings. We're doing that every day. I support the 6 committees of jurisdiction that are doing oversight of the Trump administration. And we want to get as much information about what Trump is up to out to the public so the American people are in a position to make an informed judgment when they get to the election in November of 2020. So that investigative oversight role is right now really just as important as the legislative role, and we're trying to lean into both of them.
On the gun issue, before we leave this topic, I want to focus a little bit more on the gun issue. He comes off and says things like, you've heard this all the time, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Yet the background checks that we're looking to strengthen are not background checks on guns, they're background checks on people.
Right, right.
And why don't we take a stronger stand on holding him to his own words? Because so many of his words are so ridiculous, but how do we do a better job? Because if we can get him to support it, which right now he's backing off again,
right.
If we get him to support it, maybe there'll be some influence on McConnell to actually put H.R. 8 on the floor of the Senate.
Right. Well, I think we are going to really keep the heat on the president and McConnell this time around, because I think the public has gotten to a point of outrage and frustration about the lack of action when it comes to gun safety. That phrase, guns don't kill, people do. My response to that is, guns don't die, people do. And we have to translate what, at this point, I think is a deep and abiding desire on the part of the American people, that we just put some basic common sense measures in place. Now, people will say, well, background checks, that's not going to solve everything. I agree. And I support many other measures like an assault weapons ban and other things. I mean, I'm a co-sponsor of just about every gun safety measure that's been introduced by the Democrats in the House. But the fact of the matter is, we just need to show as a people, as a country, that we can do, for starters, just one thing that'll make a difference. Yeah. I think what drives people crazy, it certainly drives me crazy, is these tragedies occur, these mass shootings, and then nothing happens. And the sense of powerlessness that leaves the public with is something that is so defeating and demoralizing. If we could just do one thing, pass a background checks bill, H.R. 8, which we passed in the House and is sitting on the Senate side, waiting for Mitch McConnell to put it on the Senate floor. If we could do that one thing, it would begin to demonstrate the American people are not powerless in the face of this scourge of gun violence, and then we can build on that. So we're going to hold the president to his word. Now, these things happen, and the next day he comes out and he demonstrates some kind of courage, it seems, because he says, oh, we got to do this, it makes sense, the American people support background checks, we got to do it. And then within a couple of weeks, he starts to get wobbly because he's on the phone with Wayne LaPierre at the NRA, who's whispering in his ear, and suddenly he starts parroting the line of the NRA and the gun lobby. So we're seeing that happen again. But we're not going to let up here. I was at a rally the other day that was sponsored by Moms Demand Action and Everytown for Gun Safety, Students Demand Action. The organizing that's going on around gun safety in this country is like nothing we've ever seen. And any movement needs both organization, which it now has, resources, which it now has. The one thing that was missing from this movement for gun safety, which we now have, is a voice. And that's young people who've been stepping up, particularly after Parkland, and saying, this madness has to stop. I'm going to put my confidence in their ability to kind of muster the leadership and the will we need to make a difference this time. So if Mitch McConnell comes back in the fall and he's not ready to put this on the Senate floor, I think there's going to be hell to pay in the public, and we're certainly going to keep pressing him on it.
Two quick things on before we move on from the guns is that he said this morning, the president said this morning that we have strong background checks, and we do. The problem is that the Verdi bill went back to 1994, before the internet, and so what we're looking for is tightening up the loopholes of those strong background checks. So that's something that we need to go back at him and not let him off the hook on that. What the bill is trying to do is to close the Charleston loophole, and also the gun show loophole, where people who go from gun show to gun show to gun show, selling their personal stock and keep replenishing their personal stock, it's not personal stock.
Right.
It's commercial sales. So anyway, but the other thing I want to mention is that he did declare a national emergency and used the National Emergency Act of 1976, which was not designed for circumventing the appropriations process, but he did that in order to get more move money for
the
his
border.
wall.
Yeah.
If we take over the Senate and the House and the presidency in 2020, do you anticipate that this is a true national emergency, the mass shootings, and that we would then the president could ban the assault rifles?
I think that's a very good question, and I think that if we get the ability to be more aggressive on this, that we should definitely consider that route. I think you can also declare a public health crisis. I very much believe that we should come at the issue of gun violence as a public health crisis. Because if you do that, actually the solutions that you start to consider are much more creative, they're much broader, and in some ways, Paul, it takes a little bit of the emotion out of the discussion because you're looking at statistics and you're responding. You know, in the same way we did when we were dealing with automobile deaths that were epidemic, and then you started to treat it as a public health crisis. What can we do to make cars safer on the front end? What protections can you put in place when somebody is inside a car driving? A seatbelt. The same kind of analysis can be brought to bear when it comes to gun violence and epidemic. So you start applying public health standards, epidemiological standards to that, and you get to the kind of solutions that make common sense. So we could declare a public health crisis based on the numbers of fatalities that we're seeing across the country. And I think we should use everything in our toolkit to really kind of deploy this moral outrage that so many Americans feel and address that sense of powerlessness, which is so debilitating to people. Again, if we could just do one thing that was real, what that would do to empower Americans and then take the next step, I think would be remarkable.
Garner more support if
For
we
sure.
show we can actually do something.
For sure.
All right, now I wanted to jump, you touched upon it with the investigative part, with your role in the Oversight Committee. Your position on impeachment, I'd like you to just to go over that, but and then I have some questions on that.
Yeah, for sure. Before I go to that, let me just mention a couple other things that we've done in the House that I think are important, that we sent to the Senate, the graveyard of McConnell. When it comes to the economy, we passed a bill raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour over a period of time. And that sits waiting for action on the Senate floor. The Paycheck Fairness Act, which would ensure equal pay for equal work for women across this country. We passed it because the American people asked us to. It sits there waiting for action on the Senate side. Protections for people with pre-existing conditions in the healthcare arena. We passed that. Again, it awaits action in the Senate. Lowering prescription drug prices. We took action on the House side. Nothing coming from the Senate. Climate action. We passed a bill that would say we have to restore our participation in the Paris Accords. McConnell won't put it on the House floor. So doing something for the dreamers, right? We talked about H.R. 8. There's all these things that Democrats have put on the floor, passed, and sent to the United States Senate. And Mitch McConnell's basically sitting there with his arms folded, blocking the doorway and saying to the American people, you shall not pass. He has to be held accountable for that, and I think in this election, we're going to hold him accountable. Now, speaking of accountability, we have a rogue president who's violating every norm that we thought were sort of accepted norms of behavior when it comes to ethics, when it comes to conflicts of interest, when it comes based on the Mueller report to these actions that were taken to obstruct investigation and so forth. When we look at the activity of his campaign during the 2016 election in terms of accepting help from the Russians and so forth. When it comes to impeachment, this is my view. Obviously, it's a drastic remedy. I think our committees of jurisdiction have to, though, continue to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And as you know, the Judiciary Committee, led by Chairman Nadler, has effectively begun an impeachment inquiry. He has the tools he needs to seek documents. For example, he's now subpoenaed the underlying grand jury evidence that formed the basis of the Mueller report and those findings. And so we're trying to get that. When that evidence comes forward, as well as evidence that's being uncovered by other committees of jurisdiction, that will become a factor in terms of the House's judgment about whether to move forward with impeachment. So I think we ought to continue to shake the trees wherever we can to get this evidence. Now, I am of the view that to impeach the president on the House side, with there being no prospect that McConnell and the Senate Republicans will convict him on the Senate side, makes that a tricky proposition, because if you impeach him and the Senate doesn't take any action or does a show trial over a week period and sort of shuts it all down, Trump will be running around waving that and saying, see, they couldn't touch me. So we have to keep that in mind. That the shorthand I use for that is, as a prosecutor, I'm wary of sending my case to a corrupt jury. Yeah. And what we have in McConnell and the Senate Republicans is a corrupt jury. Right now, there's no evidence that they're prepared to take any kind of courageous action. Having said that, the process we're going through on the House side, where we have the gavel, and we can pursue these investigations, we may begin to tease out new evidence or be able to frame the evidence that's already out there in a more compelling way that changes that dynamic and maybe sets McConnell and the House Republicans back on their heels a little bit, where they can't avoid the responsibility they have to the Constitution. And in that case, you come in and you do a reassessment of what our approach would be. But the bottom line is, let's keep the pressure on. I like the idea that we got 6 committees that are all pushing hard, and I sit on oversight, which is one of them. Judiciary is doing it, the Ways and Means Committee is doing it, Financial Affairs, and so forth. Let's get as much information. At the very least, what you're doing is you're putting evidence out there so that when we put 70 million Americans in the jury box next November, right, they've got all the exhibits they need to reach that verdict, that judgment that this president has got to go.
On that thought, though, it seems like the main argument for most Democrats for not moving forward with impeachment is the fact that it's going to die in the Senate. Is there a value, though, to letting it go to the Senate and getting them to be on record, each one of them, to be on record as supporting this corrupt president? And also, the other part is, do we run the risk of losing all the Democrats who came out in 2018 in the midterm for the specific purpose of putting the Democrats in power to hold this corrupt president to account for the wrongdoings? With Nixon, the 3 articles of impeachment were obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Forgetting about the Mueller report, just the contempt of Congress piece is like more than substantial. Probably those 3 things are more substantial with Trump than with Nixon. So my concern is, if we don't go forward and put him through a full impeachment hearing, the electorate is not going to be as educated in all the wrongdoing as they're being now by going through committee by committee.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that argument, that case, and I think it has validity, this idea that if you put it formally into the frame of an impeachment proceeding, that you would elevate it in terms of the public's paying attention to the issue. And as I say, I think that if our investigations begin to uncover evidence, not quite say smoking gun evidence, but stuff that you know would really grab the attention of the American people, then I think we need to revisit the strategy, because, I mean, the phenomenon of Trump is he's so outrageous every day that he kind of anesthetizes the public to these things. And so something comes along that in the normal course would be this flare that would sort of make everybody pay attention. But with Trump, it's just, another thing that he does during the day. But if we can, through the process of oversight and investigation that our committees are engaged in right now, begin to tease out some things that we think would rivet the country, then I think you reevaluate this idea of even recognizing that the prospects of conviction on the Senate side remain very low. Is there a value in terms of getting people's attention to having an impeachment hearing? So we'll have to see how that goes. I do know that when I talk to the average person out there, I get two pretty powerful messages. One is that they do appreciate the checks and balances that the House Democrats have now brought to bear, whether or not that takes the form of an impeachment proceeding. The fact that we have a gavel and we're doing investigations and we're calling these hearings and we're chasing down every lead is something that responds to their desire that they expressed in the 2018 midterm election. The second thing I hear from them is, yes, it's important to do that oversight, but as a person who's just getting up every day, trying to get my kids to school, want to make sure I have a decent job with good benefits, want to make sure my health care is in place, I also want to hear a lot from the Democrats on how they're going to make that happen for me in my own life. And to the extent they feel like the impeachment thing may pull away from intention and emphasis on those things, that makes them a little nervous sometimes. So it's a balance that we have to strike. But I very much believe that the combination of Democrats staking out these important positions on issues of consequence to average families, working families across the country, on health care, the economy, fighting corruption, et cetera, and making it clear that when it comes to 2020, we're the party that should be trusted to govern on those things. Plus the fact that we are doing this investigation and oversight is a compelling case to give Democrats not just the gavel again in the House, but give us the gavel in the Senate, and let's put a Democrat in the White House that can govern in a responsible way in this country. The biggest indictment I have of Donald Trump, obviously he has these severe character flaws, and every day he does things that make me grind my teeth and my blood boil. But the bottom line about him is he's just not a good president. He's not an effective president. He said he was going to do infrastructure. He hasn't done anything on that. He said he would lower prescription drug prices. He hasn't achieved that. He said that he would protect our country, but he's doing nothing on election security, even though we know the Russians are going to come back in 2020 and try to hack in to things. So he makes all these promises. He was going to drain the swamp. Yeah. It's deeper than it's ever been. So people have to fundamentally judge him, both, yes, on the character flaws, which are real, but also just the fact that he's not getting the job done like he promised he would. And we have an election coming. And that's the great thing about our democracy is, every 2 years, but certainly every 4 years when it comes to the president, the people have the opportunity to go register their opinion on this. And I think they're going to do that in a resounding fashion because I think so many Americans have pocketed 1 or 2 or 3 or a dozen grievances with this president. And come November 3rd, they're going to take those grievances out of their pocket and they're going to go put them in the ballot box and say, we need something new.
You mentioned about infrastructure. Just as an aside, I was at the White House and Kellyanne had, this is just a few weeks ago, one of those gaggles, and she was ranting about how the White House is working on infrastructure and the Congress is doing nothing on infrastructure. So I said, does that mean, I actually got called on, and I raised my hand, I got called on, and I said, does that mean that the president will welcome back, quote unquote, Chuck and Nancy to continue the discussion on infrastructure? Right. And she said, these are her words, absolutely, cause, but not if they accuse him of a cover-up. And
right.
that was the end of that.
Look, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof of whether he's followed through on his promises are there for everybody to see. He's a bad president. He doesn't know what he's doing. He can't keep the promises that he made. And the American people ought to send him packing, both because he's an offense to our basic morals and values, but also because he's just not very good at the job. And let's get somebody in there who can do it.
If we do take back the presidency and the Senate and keep the House, how do you see us fixing the court system, specifically the Supreme Court? How do we undo the damage that was done over these last 3 years?
Well, a lot of damage has been done, and obviously we hang on to those members of the court who seem to see the world in an appropriate way, and we want them to hang on. I think what we want to get back to is a process, not just when it comes to who serves on the Supreme Court, but who serves at all levels in our federal court system, of picking judges who are going to act in a responsible way and don't appear to be, as many of the judges that have been selected by President Trump and confirmed by the process that Mitch McConnell controls, appear to be, which is overly ideological with a political agenda that they're carrying out, very much towing to a kind of litmus test agenda that the right wing has imposed. Unfortunately, the whole process of picking Supreme Court justices has become much more political over the last few years. And I don't know whether we can actually get back to a different place in terms of how that happens. I do think that when it comes to clearing the decks on basic democracy issues, the Democrats should be very aggressive if we get the gavel in both houses and we get the White House, including looking at the filibuster rule, which obviously McConnell and his cohort has manipulated changes on that in his favor. I think when it comes to basic democracy reform, voting reforms to fight voter suppression, campaign finance reform, and other things, that we should be pretty bold and aggressive, even procedurally, in making sure we get those reforms done. And then you go from there, because we know, you and I know, because we've talked about this many times, if the institutions, the democratic institutions, are sclerotic, if they're not working the way they should because of undue influence, or they've been compromised in some ways, which frankly McConnell has engineered over decades, they can't deliver what the people want in all of these other areas. So reforming the system, unrigging the system, is the gateway issue that allows you to go do all the other things that people care about. And we have 2 case studies available to us, Paul, of where the American people can take their anger about corruption. The 2016 case study, where they took that anger and they handed a baseball bat to a demagogue named Donald Trump, who promised that he would go to Washington and clean it all up. So they gave their power to him. And that hasn't worked out so well. And then we have the 2018 case study, where the American people took that anger, leaned towards their better angels, and gave an assignment to a team of reformers who had an actual plan. And I was proud to have helped develop that blueprint, which was H.R. 1, and said to them, we want you to go to Washington and clean up this system. And those candidates said, we'll do it in the first 100 days. And they followed through on their promise, because on March 8th, 2019, within the first 100 days, the Democratic House of Representatives passed the most comprehensive, groundbreaking piece of anti-corruption, pro-democracy legislation that we've seen, and showed the American people we can follow through on our promises. When you give us that gavel and we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it. So if you want to see that same kind of change on the U.S. Senate side of things, give us a gavel in the Senate. And if you want to see a president who will sign that in the Oval Office, change the leadership at the top. That's the promise. That's what we offer people. If you have two options, don't go with the 16 solution to your anger, which was Donald Trump. Go with the 18 solution to your anger, which was a team of courageous, inspired reformers who are actually following through on their promises.
I think that is a perfect place to end this interview. That's a good message. And thank you so much for spending time with us.
I appreciate it.
We're going to get this out to the public as quickly as possible.
Thank you.